Alles klar. All right, everybody. Thank you very much for being here today. Before I get started, I want to give a big shout out to Yevgen for putting this conference together. I'm sure many of you guys have met him by now, and he's been really a driving force in creating the local IT community here. So really big shout out to him. And also, of course, thank you to Bürgermeister Sven Veit for opening up this event. I'm actually really honored today to be the first person speaking here today because our startup kind of grew up here in the Hoekwerk over the last 6 years. So now I get to stand here and tell you guys how we build our business in an industry that actually seemed impossible to build a business model in. And so it's kind of a surreal moment, so I really appreciate that I get to have this today. So let's get started. I'm going to be talking about first principles thinking. And to give you some context why I'm talking about this and where I got these philosophies from, you should know a little bit about me. That's me right there, if you can't tell. And the most interesting thing about me is probably that I lived in the United States of America for about 7 years of my life. I went to high school there, I went to college there, I have family there, and I got my bachelor's degree in cyber operations there. And I was fortunate enough to work in the financial sector with Citibank, First Premier Bank, and Secure Banking Solutions, a lot of banks you can tell, and these are all very cybersecurity heavy roles that I had there. So it was a lot about system thinking, about system hacking, and finding different attack vectors. And so that really led me into an industry where I was trying to figure out how systems work outside of software. Now, I'm going to be talking about first principle thinking and the philosophy behind that. And here's just a quick agenda. I mean, you guys can obviously tell I used AI to generate all of these slides, and I hope that works. If that seems weird for some reason, please leave me feedback for that. So I want to bring you guys some real examples of what first principle thinking actually looks like. I want to talk about how we applied this in our business, and then I also want to talk about how you can use it in your business. And my real goal for this talk is that when you're done, you still have some of these analogies and examples that I present today in your head when you go home tonight. If you have some visual ideas in your head, you remember that talk, then it's going to be very easy for you to remember what I was talking about and apply it in your own home, in your own life, in your own business. And then at the very end, I have a couple of motivational words for some of the potential entrepreneurs here today. I'm an entrepreneur, so is my co-founder here. I'm assuming most of you guys are in the business world in one factor or another. So let's get started. This is one of my favorite assumptions that existed before the electronic vehicle industry was revolutionized by Tesla. Many years ago, if you asked engineers if you can build and scale an EV car successfully, they would tell you that there's many reasons against this, and one of the biggest reasons was that back then, the batteries were just too expensive. So whenever engineers would get together and they would maybe talk about and brainstorm like, hey, how could we build an electric car? There was examples of that, but one of the biggest reasons people assumed that you cannot make that in a profitable, scalable way was the fact that the batteries are just way more expensive than the gasoline engines. And it turned out that that was just an assumption people had, and that assumption turned out to be wrong, because obviously, once you have the capitalistic competition coming in, the price of batteries started dropping immediately. And it's really important here, maybe there's a laser pointer here as well. Anyway, it's really important here to point out what the scale is. So in the first little drop you have, it's nearly half. So it's $10,000 going down to $5,000. Now we're down here, and you can see the decline starts to accelerate even more as we adopt EVs. So Tesla really, the company really had that assumption, and they questioned the assumption to find out if it's actually true. And they were one of the first companies to really say, that assumption isn't true at all. Of course the price of batteries are going to drop. So they had a huge advantage over their entire market segment because they just realized that, well, nobody thinks that batteries are going to become that cheap. We're just going to assume that batteries are going to be that cheap, and we're going to start building a business case around that. And it's a perfect example of first principles thinking, because first principles thinking, when you really break it down, it's very simple. You look at assumptions that exist in your business, and you constantly question them and try to figure out if they still hold true today. So you can kind of look at it like that. You have a lot of assumptions in any situation where multiple people from different areas have to work together. And because you're not an expert in every field, you have to make some assumptions about fields where you're not an expert in. So there's a lot of assumptions that are probably wrong. In Germany, that's like a meme where people say, oh, we've always done it that way. So you just assume that that is how you have to do it. And then so with first principle thinking, you try to break these assumptions apart until you find an assumption that does turn out to be true, and that will be considered a first principle from which you have to reason upwards again. So let's talk about assumptions. I'm going to be saying the word assumptions a lot. I hope that's okay. Assume you have a business or any collaborative project, and you have people from different areas of expertise. Now in the bottom left, for example, we have a software developer. In the top right, we have a scientist. In the bottom right, we have a business analyst. The software developer knows obviously a lot about software development, but when the software developer is thinking about science or business analytics, he just has to make some assumptions to abstract away the things that he doesn't really understand. The same goes for the scientist. The scientist knows a lot about science, obviously, but the scientist has to make assumptions about how some software works because that person's not an expert there. And so just generally speaking, logically, assumptions just happen all the time. We probably have more assumptions about the world than we have factual knowledge. And so it's really easy to find assumptions that you can question to find out if they're actually true or not. And when you find an assumption that everybody believes to be true, but it's actually false, you have a lot of potential to improve something about your business. How's the sound? Is that going well? I think I can go a little bit closer. It's going to be louder. Is that better if I go like this? Okay, perfect. I'm just going to start kissing the microphone. Okay. So, I have a slide here, and before I go to the next slide, does anyone know what the next slide might be? Because the AI is kind of already giving a hint. All right. So, let's look at an example. Let's say you're a rocket scientist and you've been building cooling systems for rocket engines for 20 years of your life, 2 decades. You're an expert, right? And first principle thinking basically looks like this. Someone who doesn't know what they're talking about when it comes to cooling systems for rocket engines, they come to you and they start asking you really stupid questions. And those questions are usually also very naive, like, hey, why do we even need this? Why does that have to look like that? Now, this is a fundamental difference between Americans and Germans. Americans are extremely overconfident. Americans will assume that if you are the expert, if I ask you a stupid question because you're the expert, you can answer that question very easily and you can help me get rid of my potentially wrong assumption. In Germany, this is a little bit more difficult. Usually it creates some kind of friction, because people don't really want their expertise questioned. You know, in Germany, you usually get a kind of a reaction like, why do you even worry about this? This is my area, let me worry about this, you take care of your stuff. And this is why I think in America, the first principle thinking just has become like a standard way of thinking in the tech sector. And in Germany, this is very difficult. You need to have a very close-knit team. You need people that are ready to communicate, and you need to have spontaneous discussions about topics that might not even seem relevant in a certain meeting. So this is not actually a fake example that I came up with. This is literally what SpaceX did. Who here has seen this image before? Maybe show of hands. Okay, there was a couple of people, a lot less than I thought, so let me explain what we're looking at here. This is a rocket engine called the Raptor, and it was designed by SpaceX. We see the first version of the Raptor engine all the way on the left, and then we see how the iterations became, I'm just going to say, like a little bit more sexy, right? It looks cool, it looks more functional. And on the right side, we have this really cool looking rocket engine that doesn't seem complicated at all. So how did they use first principle thinking to improve their rocket engine? So when we're looking on the left side, the thing that makes this engine very complex is the cooling system. And the assumption is that rocket engines, they're under a lot of pressure, they get really hot, and some components cannot handle the heat, so you have to cool the entire thing down. That's why you need complex cooling systems. And then they started really second-guessing these things that seemed obvious to people who've built the cooling systems for years. And they figured out that, well, it's actually a wrong assumption to assume that you have to cool down all the parts of the rocket engine. What you actually really have to worry about, and that is now the first principle, you have to worry about where the heat is and where the components are that cannot handle the heat. Some components can obviously handle the heat. So once they realized that they can more worry about where the heat is, they started to redesign and rearrange parts of the rocket engine. And so you can kind of see that, you know, the heat obviously happens in this area. So they moved everything further up and away from that couldn't handle the heat. But the components that could handle the heat, they were fine. And once they realized that this is something they can really get a lot of value from, not only did they make the production process easier, but you can see here on the numbers, the engine itself became better, right? And now obviously, this is a really cool example of just questioning something fundamental and probably having at least one really awkward conversation with your cooling scientist, on your cooling engineer to get to this point, but it's clearly worth it to have these conversations. Now, I said earlier that assumptions have to be questioned again and again because as new technologies arise, new assumptions might now not be true anymore. So this is the Raptor engine right now. But if we look at it, we can see, you know, there's still different components that are welded together. You can see at the top, it seems like there's something that's bolted together. So there's obviously points of failure that might still blow up, might still make it difficult to produce the rocket engine. And so in assumptions you might nowadays ask yourself is, why do we even have to build an engine and then build a cooling system on top of that? What if the engine and the cooling system is the same thing, right? 10 years, you couldn't really answer the assumption because there was no technology that would allow for that, but nowadays there is. This is a company called Leap 71. It's actually a German lady. I think her name is Josephine Linnen. And this company exists in Dubai. And they're using 3D metal printing to build rocket engines that have the cooling system directly designed inside of them. So the rocket engine and the cooling system is the same thing. So now you can come up with designs like this. And when you're looking at this picture now, this actually makes a lot of sense. Why wouldn't you have the cooling built in directly into the engine? You can come up with way cooler looking engines, by the way, it looks way cooler. And you can also, again, improve the performance and you can improve the production process. And this is not a 3D render concept. This is a real rocket engine that they're actively blowing up in Dubai every single day. And this is really crazy because if you're looking at this picture, you can see there's ice crystals still forming on the left side of the engine, while on the other side, the rocket blast is shooting out, right? So this is, again, a perfect example of someone just looking at the current technology and then looking at assumptions that everybody thinks are true and trying to figure out if they are still true with the new information they have. So those were some cool examples. I'm talking about electric cars, I'm talking about rocket engines, I'm talking about 3D printed metals. And the question is, how can we apply this to something boring like a SaaS platform, right? So in our business, what we sell is a software as a service, a SaaS platform, and it's just not that sexy like a rocket engine. However, we can still apply the same mental framework to gain value. So this is our software. It's a two-dimensional web interface. It's not that crazy. And what we do is we archive social media posts for government entities. We actually work with the federal government already. The Bundespresseamt is a client of ours. If you go to the bundesregierung.de, you will literally have our technology being loaded onto your device. And the question is, how were we able to do that? Because when you talk about working in the public sector in Germany, I hope this is fine, I'm just going closer. When you talk about working with the public sector in Germany, there are a lot of negative assumptions. And these are not assumptions that we had, these are also assumptions that everybody was telling us, right? So the first assumption, government projects are just hard to deploy. When you want to build tech for the government, it's just a nightmare. It takes forever, and it's just, there's no way you can effectively do that. And then, of course, because of that, there's no way you can scale government projects. You know, we have a decentralized government system. It's basically impossible for the federal level to dictate what software the local level should use. So if you're a business, you have to acquire every single entity yourself. Then, of course, government projects take way too long. So again, it's going to be very difficult to get a lot of value there if you have to acquire all these clients. And then in Germany, and that was the biggest assumption that everybody had. When we started doing this in 2020, everybody was telling us, including the government itself, that the government in Germany will leave social media. This is an article from a newspaper that is specifically for the government entities, and the Federal Data Privacy Officer was publicly saying that all the government entities should delete what was back then called Facebook fan pages, right? So why would we ever think about starting a business in this area? Well, it's because we just questioned all of these assumptions, and when we looked at the way we use technology and the reality of social media, none of these were basically relevant, right? If you look at social media all over the world, it was growing. There was no indicator that social media usage was going to go down. We just assumed that, it's our assumption that turned out to be true, we assumed that the government will have to start using social media eventually at a big scale. So when we now have this idea, we start, okay, let's just try it out. I mean, what's the worst that can happen? We don't have to build a factory. It's a SaaS platform. So this is our team here. This is my co-founder, Adrian. He's right there. And we started even before Corona to really go on site, meet our clients, really go to all of these city council meetings, convince everyone, try to get everybody approved, and really just pitch the idea constantly and get client after client. And in the beginning, it really seemed like the assumptions were actually true. It was very difficult to talk to the tech people in the government. It was very difficult to deploy and scale this because at the beginning, with every business, we didn't really know how to do it. But then after a couple of years and working in this business, we realized that, well, these were just because we had these assumptions from other people from the past. When we're looking at the assumptions that we had, the only assumption that was really true, and that was our first principle, was the fact that, yes, it does take a lot of time for government projects to complete because the government has internal processes and checks and balances that we cannot affect. So it does take a lot of time for government projects to complete. However, the other three assumptions were wrong, and this is now a market advantage that we had. So it is actually not difficult at all to deploy a SaaS product, right? The assumption that it's difficult to deploy technology in the government sector comes from the fact that back in the day you had to like mail a CD or maybe even set up a server on site. You do not have to do that anymore, so the assumption that it takes a lot to set up is just wrong. And because of this, it's also wrong, that it's difficult to scale. It's not difficult to scale. It doesn't matter if you work at the federal level or if you work at the local level. You're a human person on a computer. So why would the process for onboarding be any different? It's the exact same process. It's extremely scalable. And then, of course, the biggest assumption that turned out to be wrong, that the German government is leaving social media. It obviously was predictable to us that they would have to adopt social media. And they did, and we were able to capitalize on that. So we have assumptions that we used first principle thinking to figure out that they were wrong. So how could we actually use that to provide value? It's like cool, it feels cool to know that you were right about something, but how can we actually use that to improve our business? So we do know from first principles that it does take a lot of time to complete government projects, but we know that the deployment of the technology can be done in an online meeting, and the onboarding of the user can be done in the same online meeting, because it's just a SaaS account that you're setting up. So what we started doing, we just started working on many different government projects in parallel. Because once we got done with that first initial meeting, that first initial pitch, they just disappear inside their own internal processes. We didn't have to worry. Eventually, like maybe after a month, in some cases even after years, they would just come back to us and say, hey, okay, we want to buy the software now. But we didn't wait for one project to complete. We just started the next one. And then we just got an email someday, hey, we're now ready to buy it. Okay, let's make an online meeting and onboard, and we're good to go. And obviously, because we have a SaaS platform, you guys all understand this, it's extremely easy. You set up a user account, you verify it with the email, and then you have the account ready to go. They immediately have access to your user interface and can start getting the service and the value that they pay for. And this is one of the reasons why I really wanted to give this talk, because maybe I have somewhat of a unique perspective, having worked in America, also as an entrepreneur, but also in the financial sector, which is like a lot of money, so a lot of serious people, at least you would hope. Germany has kind of like a mental sickness where we are masters at making assumptions. I mean, there really are so many assumptions that I hear from people every day that they're just 100% wrong, and the only reason they are wrong is because nobody dared to question them. And you can already tell from this really cool AI picture, and sarcasm here, why this might be the case, right? It's obviously the case that in Europe, we have an extremely complex regulatory framework. So like I said in the beginning, when we have this picture with the different roles in the company, there we go. Now assume that between all of these connections are 1 billion laws, right? So obviously you have to create even more assumptions when you're talking to people from other areas, because you don't know what legality they have to work with or they have to worry about. So you have to make assumptions all the time if you're making business cases in Germany. But again, that just means that there's more assumptions that you can question, and then there's probably a lot of assumptions that you can find out are wrong that will give you an advantage over your competitors, or maybe generally give you a leg up when you start a new branch or industry. So here's an assumption that everybody here can relate to. There's an assumption in Europe, especially in Germany, that you're not allowed to process personal data because of GDPR. We call it Datenschutz. And this assumption is 100% factually wrong. This is not true at all. People assume that. They assume that data privacy is this big issue and that it's like very difficult to process personal data, and it's just not true at all. It is not true because it turns out when you use first principle thinking, you arrive at a very simple legal reality. Now, we learned this the hard way through many years of talking to not only federal, but obviously local and many different data privacy officers. But what I did yesterday, I literally just prompted ChatGPT and I said, hey, this is the entire prompt. Hey, apply first principle thinking to the GDPR and tell me what your key insight is. And within, as you guys know, 5 seconds, the text paragraph appeared, and it basically said, well, the assumption that you're not allowed to process personal data is wrong. The first principle is you are definitely explicitly allowed to process personal data if the person agrees and if they know what you're actually doing. And now when you're hearing this, you say, yeah, of course. I mean, that's probably what it was the entire time. I knew that. But this is like a completely different reality than the assumption on the left. This is completely different, right? One is like saying, oh, we cannot do this, and the other one's saying, of course you can do that. So we go from the GDPR is assumed to say, don't use data, and the reality is more like, don't surprise people with how you use data. A perfect example here would be Facebook and Meta. If you make your Facebook account 10 years ago, and now they're saying, hey, we're going to use your pictures to generate an AI model, then you're like, hey, I didn't know that you were going to do that. That's not fair. So now we can protect your data. But if I'm a German company and I say, hey, listen, I want to take your pictures and I'm going to train an AI model, if the user agrees to that, you can definitely do that here in Germany. There is no reason why you couldn't. So this is not legal advice, but this is something that I've checked with many, many data privacy officers. And if you want to take a picture, this would be the one to do right here, because here's how you can build a business around personal data in Germany. It's very simple. You have an idea, you explain what data you need from the user and what you plan to do with it. If the user agrees, you can start selling your product. You need two things for this. You have a privacy policy, because that's where you explain what data you need and how you use it. And then for some bigger clients, especially in the public sector, there's a PDF that you have to send in an email, and then you get it back in the email, and then it's done. This is the AVV, we call it the Auftragsverarbeitungsvertrag. It's just a PDF that, again, explicitly explains what is written in your data privacy policy. But it turns out it's the exact same document every time. Once you have that document one time, it really isn't that big of a deal. So these are the two things that you probably will need, and once you have that, you're done. You can build a data-driven business on personalized data in Germany. And here I have an example for you guys. This is a real email that I got from a data privacy officer. We pitched our product, and they wrote back, and they said, here's 14 legal documents you need to produce for us before we can start checking if we can use your software. And I got to say, I hope a little bit of profanity is OK, but my team had the bollocks to really just say, we're not doing that. There's no way we're going to spend the next 2 weeks taking the information that's already in our data privacy policy and putting it into these PDF files for you. So what we did is we said, hey, listen, why don't we have an online meeting? We just talk about it, and then we can tell you what you want to know. And after 5 minutes, it was clear we didn't have to do any of that. That data privacy officer had an assumption that was wrong, and now you can imagine every single piece of software that they bought had to go through this process, and it was completely unnecessary. And it just took us one time to really ask, like, hey, do we really have to do this? Why? And the person couldn't explain it to us. Now, that was a boring example. Let's go to a more cool example again. This was a big scandal here in Germany. I'm sure we've all heard about it. How the hell was a foreign company able to build one of the largest factories on Earth in Germany in nearly 2 years? This seems insane if you're saying this or telling this to a German person. And it's very simple. We're going to be done with the slide in a second. The assumption was that you have to wait till every permit is approved to start building. It's wrong. Once you have access to the land, you can start building immediately, as long as you're willing to take on the legal risk that you build everything up to code. Now, of course, there were a couple of things where the public entities were saying, hey, this cannot be built like that, this cannot be built like that, and then Tesla had to change that. And so they probably had to spend a couple months extra on construction to fix the mistakes they made, but a couple months added to 2 years is nothing compared to what we Germans are thinking in. We cannot build an Autobahn bridge in less than 5 years. This is one of the biggest factories on Earth. And the assumption was that you have to wait until the permit process is done, and you just don't have to do that. If you're willing to take the risk, you can start right away. That was the key insight, again, from Tesla. Now, how can you start applying this to your own business? Most of us are not rocket scientists, and most of us do not build gigafactories. So let's assume we have a regular office job. If you want to apply first principles thinking, it's best to do it in a group of people from different areas. And that means that you should start with annoying stuff. Maybe you have a meeting once a month that all the managers have to be a part of, and nobody actually wants to do that meeting. So if you're saying, OK, the next time we have that meeting, let's spend an extra hour trying to figure out how we never have to have that meeting again. Because 10 years ago, when the founders said that we have to do this meeting every month, there was no AI, there was no automation tools like we have today. So everyone in this meeting is going to be very motivated to figure out a way to get rid of this meeting, because they're all annoyed by it anyway. And this is a very easy way to start applying first principles thinking to processes or certain steps in your production line that you want to improve. You just bring people from different areas together, you start asking stupid questions, and then you really go through the details of explaining, well, we have to do it this way because. And then you get the right questions where you definitely, I can almost guarantee this, you will find things where you realize, we just assumed that we had to do this, but we don't actually have to do that at all. And now I'm going to come to the end here of my talk, and this is kind of my appeal to all the potential entrepreneurs here in Germany. Please start a business. If you have a business idea, it was never in the entire history of mankind easier than to try a business right now. If you are in Germany, you probably have this same sickness that I was talking about earlier, where you have a cool business idea, and then immediately you start thinking about, would this actually be legal? But especially if you're an innovator, if you build a new piece of technology, you will never be able to answer this legal question. So my advice would be, don't worry about the legality of things. The only thing, and the really only question you should answer in the very beginning is there someone there who's willing to pay me money for that? If you have 2 or 3 companies that say, wow, if you make a prototype, I'm definitely going to buy it, then you're going to be very motivated after this conversation to figure out the legality of things if you have to figure it out. But generally speaking, you need customers first. You need feedback from real people that are willing to put their money on the line to take up on your product and your service. And that is one of the biggest problems that we have in Europe. We have a problem where private companies are not taking on new credits and they're not really investing money in here because the regulatory framework is unclear. And the reason that's unclear is because if you build new technology like some crazy AI model, there cannot be any regulation because it doesn't exist. Something has to exist first before politicians can really talk about how to regulate it. You need to have Facebook first to figure out what the side effects are so that you can then write regulation to figure out how to minimize these side effects. And it is actually your job as an innovator to really think, okay, obviously, I just have to build something that provides value, that people are willing to pay money for, but it also has to be something that doesn't harm people. If your innovation only brings value and doesn't harm anyone, why would you be worried about, the regulators destroying or, punishing your business? This is not the case. So this is what innovation is actually about. The figuring out the legal side of things is part of the entire innovation, but first you need the product and the value so that you can put it in context for potential regulation that happens later. And that kind of is the same thing with the data privacy thing. Just explain people what you're actually doing, maybe what chemicals do you plan to use, maybe how much electricity do you need to offer your service. And if people, agree to this and are willing to pay you money, now you have a business case. And this is something that we're really missing here because at the EU level, they write a lot of these big, like the EU AI Act and the Data Act, they write these legal frameworks with words that are so vague that if I ask 3 lawyers, and this has literally happened, I ask 3 lawyers, they give me 3 different answers. If you have this much uncertainty, it's clear that you just have to take the risk on yourself. Now, the reason the EU is doing that is that this is like their only weapon they have against these big tech companies. So whenever the EU people in Brussels think someone's doing something immoral, then they can use this vague language to then try to kind of put this in front of the law and get a legal precedent to kind of rein in the big power there. But we're not Meta, we're not Tesla, we're probably starting all as small companies, and so we should be more worried about bringing a good value to society that people are willing to pay for, and then the rest usually follows automatically after this. Okay. So I hope that made sense. That was the first talk today. It was a very interesting topic for me. As you can probably tell, I'm very passionate about first principles thinking because my livelihood depends on it now. So if you would like to ask some questions, maybe you guys can try out this QR code. This is from the app that Yevgen made. And of course, if we don't have time, I'm going to be here for the hackathon all day. There's going to be a Preisverleihung. I don't even know what that's called, but the competition, the presentation for the hackathon is happening at the end of the day. I would really appreciate it if you guys are there. Those were kids that never really programmed before, and every team was able to successfully program an Android app on a phone. So that's very cool. I encourage you guys to see that. But yeah, that was it all from me. And then if you have any questions, please let me know now. Thank you.
Whether your presentation made sense, and I think it did make a lot of sense, actually. We want to hear your questions. I'm checking my phone, I'm not texting, I'm just checking whether there's questions coming in, but I think so far it's only me who said, please post questions. Don't be shy.
Does anyone want to hear any crazy stories working with the federal government and the data-based tech business? We have a lot of stories there. Maybe that's more for the one-on-one things. There's a question right there. Oh, you can just ask it right now.
You can also just raise your hand.
Yeah.
It works also analog. Okay, so one of the questions I would have is that talk that you had about the 14 points with the Datenschutzbeauftragte.
Yeah.
How did that 5-minute talk go? That would be one of those stories. So
yeah.
What did you get after 5 minutes that she said, actually, you don't have to give us all of this or any of this?
Yeah. So The only real answer to this question is fear. So the question is like, how did it come to this email? How did the conversation go once we had this online meeting? It's fear, right? In Germany, we have so many regulations, especially in public sectors. People are really worried that they're accidentally breaking one of the rules. So they're going to spend like literally like 10 times more on trying to make sure that they don't break the rules than actually doing the work that is governed by the rules. And so when we had that meeting, it was actually super fun because that lady, it was that lady actually, she never gets invited to any of these meetings. She's usually the bad person that blocks everything in the back of the office. So we invited her to an online meeting and we told her like, listen, so we're just really wondering like why you need all these documents because every single piece of information you're asking for is right here. And then we just put the URL to our privacy policy in the chat of the Google meeting. And then she realized like, oh yeah, that's true, but aren't you doing this? Or that's like, no, we're not doing any of that. We're using this data and then we're archiving it this way on servers here in Germany. And you can read up all about this in our terms of services. And then you can kind of see like in her own mind, I think she was realizing that like, yeah, that makes a lot more sense. Like, why do I usually ask for 14 documents? And that's one of these assumptions, right? Maybe someone told her that she has to do that, and so she just had to believe that person. But that's exactly how that works, yeah.
All right, very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Yep.
If you deploy a SaaS platform for the government, can you just bring your own hardware, deploy it on your own servers, or how does that work?
So the question is if you can deploy the hardware on your own servers, and then obviously the web interface is still going to be accessed remotely, right? So the entire value that we have through the SaaS idea is that you do not deploy the hardware on site, but you're asking if you have your hardware like in your room at home.
I don't know, can you like, not on AWS because it's in America, but can you just use like Hetzner and deploy it there?
Yeah, we use Hetzner. Yeah, literally, like all of our servers are deployed on Hetzner. He can probably answer that question better for you later. But yeah, that's literally what we do. So I think technically speaking, legally speaking, you can probably definitely just host it on like a server in your house. You just have to probably, one time write all the information down in the terms of services. There's a lot of things that you have to say, like how secure is the server? What are your security policies? This is like a PDF file you generate one time. You obviously check it very detailed to make sure it's correct, but then you can definitely do that, yeah. All right. Any other questions? Yes?
I have a question about the scaling, because you mentioned that you have to deal with the different entities in Germany, like the different states.
Yep.
But you did not, when you talked about how you did scaling, you did not talk about how the different regulations or how you overcome the kind of their own assumptions or.
Yeah.
So how did you manage to get them the same solution and convince them?
Yeah.
It's fine for them.
So we're going to apply first principle thinking to your question because it's actually a false assumption that there's different regulatory frameworks. It turns out once you talk about a SaaS platform, we just have a user account and you sign in. Every single state has the same fundamental rules. They don't even know that themselves, right? So when we started here with the Landkreis Karlsruhe with Karlsruhe, Neustadt, Bad Schönborn, and which was Baden-Württemberg mainly. Once we started going to Hessen and got some clients there, and Nordrhein-Westfalen is like a client of ours to state. We also assumed falsely in the beginning that they might have different data privacy rules. And they have different data privacy rules, but it's just different legal language. When you break it down to first principles, it's basically the same thing. Tell us how you're going to use the data, don't use it any other way, and make sure the user consents that you're allowed to use their data. So that's the assumption that we figured out, we assumed that we have to get like a different thing for each state, for each entity, but it's not the case at all. The only real difference was this thing here, where, right there. Sometimes you need an EVV, sometimes you don't. Right? And then sometimes they already have a template, so you just fill out their template instead of them filling out yours. But that really isn't that complex of a business process. It's just an email exchange one time. Yeah. Okay. Is that a question right there?
Yes, I have one question. Is how do you handle it when the governments, people from the government, tells you they know more about tech than you, and you have to explain them at the first principle? Because when I was a project manager for the electronic recipe, it was the biggest problem was to discuss how we have to do it. Because it feels like there's a group of persons who some use WhatsApp, and then he knows, okay, I know how tech works, and you have to explain this, and he said, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
It's probably in the end of the project,
Yeah.
it doesn't work because they do so many rules inside that the first principles is so hard to deploy the mindset.
Yeah.
And ask how
How to handle that, yeah.
How do you handle this problem?
Yeah. A lot of artificially pushed up patriotism that you need for yourself, and a lot of patience would be my answer. Because it really is this problem that I was talking about versus America versus Germany, and that's exactly what you're saying. So we literally had discussions. I'm not going to tell about who it was, but big government entities that were telling us that we could not do certain things, but we said, we know what the law says, we can definitely do that, and they just wouldn't believe us. So sometimes sadly, you're going to run into a human wall, and this is why we have such a big problem in Germany with the government digitalization, because you have people there that know the rules in their head perfectly, but they don't want to admit that a lot of these things that they understand are actually assumptions. And so this is the only thing you can do. This is why we cannot magically just deploy a SaaS platform and have the Germany app. The problem is that humans need to talk to each other like this, and in German politics especially, you do not have conversations like this. And this is exactly the problem. So I would actually encourage you, if you get into this field, practice this. This is exactly what you need to do. You need to learn how to very politely make people aware that there might be an optimization if you're looking at what the law actually says, and you have to do that in a way to not kind of piss them off. And this is not always fun, but especially in the government sector, if you do it successfully 1 or 2 times, of course you can then get a lot of value, because then you're going to be one of the pioneers that have this crazy insight that none of the politicians had. So yeah, that's not like a super hopeful answer, but it is the truth, sadly. That's what we have to deal with here in Germany, yeah. All right.
2 more minutes left. That's 1 question. Amazing.
Is all your business in communal sector in Germany or also in other countries?
So I think right now we're in Germany. We have some connections to Österreich, to Austria, because it's a very similar idea. Again, on first principles, they basically have the same data privacy rules that we have, but of course, legally speaking, they have different laws, right? You see how that's different. So we're just in Germany right now, but we're really trying to scale on an EU-wide level, because it turns out the EU has hundreds of thousands of social media accounts from all the politicians in every other country in the parliament itself. So this is the next level that we're trying to reach, is kind of expand out of Germany into Europe. And ironically speaking, nothing speaks against us even going international, because you would assume that a business like social media archiving wouldn't work in the United States of America. But it totally does, and there's like 5 companies that do this full time, where they archive social media content from public institutions for legal reasons. Now, obviously, I'm explaining our company in the least sexy way possible. There's a lot more value that's going to arrive once you have all that social media data aggregated in one database. But obviously, what we're focused on right now is Germany. I mean, we have the federal government, we have many Bundesministerien already as clients, so we don't really know where else to go except for like really getting into every state and getting all of the cities. So that's our primary focus, but there is definitely plans for expansion that we're already working on actively.
Thanks. And I have one connection question, which
Yeah.
is, you are German basically, and your business is in Germany. Why are we having this discussion in English?
Yeah, I was actually asking Yevgen. And he was saying that there might be a lot of people that are here from international areas, because we have a big tech sector here, and there might be people looking for jobs. So people who are looking for jobs who might not be perfect German speakers, they might appreciate one of the presentations being in English. Also, it might be a little bit interesting, wake you guys up a little bit. And personally, I like speaking English a lot more, because this is kind of where I learned how to talk about business. And so therefore, I hope that wasn't too big of a hurdle for you guys. But yeah, maybe it'll make you remember the presentation more, the crazy American guy talking about rocket engines. Yeah, that would be great, actually. All right, any other questions? I think I saw a hand somewhere twitch for a second. Maybe in the back somewhere. Okay. Danke.
Ich habe noch was Kleines, was ich überreichen darf. Einmal die gebrandete Flasche.
Ist es die erste, die heute übergeben wird, oder?
Ich glaube ja.
Perfekt, also später auf eBay dann für 500 €. Okay, perfekt, Dankeschön. Dankeschön.
Und eine kleine Urkunde
Oh.
als Zeichen der Anerkennung für deine Zeit und für die vielen Insights, die du geliefert hast. Vielen Dank.
Perfekt, vielen Dank. Dankeschön fürs Dasein.